me to the computer. Okay, you can also feel free to ring it in the chat, and I'll do that. We're in the middle of a question. Question is, the idea that a worker gets to eat, is that sort of a monetary privilege that he has, which in effect it's transferable, or do we say it's in the category of what we call isser, meaning if we look at what the Torah tells us to do, there's two areas. It tells us to have to act between our fellow man. It gives us monetary privileges and obligations, and then there are obligations to God. Now, some of those look like it's an obligation to your friend, but it's really an obligation to God. For example, honoring your father and mother, right? It's not an obligation. It's an obligation to your father and mother, but it's in the category of mitzvahs that belongs to God. It's a ben adam l'makam mitzvah as well as ben adam l'chaverei, but it's primarily ben adam l'makam. And that's seen from the fact that it's in the first 5 of the 10 commandments. All the other ones are between man and God. And then there are monetary privileges. Like, for example, a person can forgive his friend for stealing. He can even in advance, allow him to do it, and there's no violation. The question is, what category do we put feeding your workers? Is that a monetary obligation which can be transferred, or is it an obligation to God? It's sort of it's an isser obligation. In that case, you don't have a right to transfer. Now, in either case, we learn from the verse that you may forgive it. Because even if God commands you to feed your workers on the job, the worker is still allowed to forgive it. The question is mainly can it be transferred? Toshma, where is it? 5 lines down from 92b. Continue with a bunch of proofs here. He hired, we'll get to this Mishnah, it's the next Mishnah, we'll see it hopefully later today, to work with Neter Ravai. So what is Neter Ravai? We know that the Torah prohibits you to benefit from a tree for the first 3 years. That's called Orla. In Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, it's only when you are certain that the tree is not yet 3 years old. It's interesting. I was in a factory once, and they told me that there's this weird thing, this basic agricultural product, but for some reason it's not kosher. So I said, "What is it?" So they say it's called papain. Papain is derivative from the papaya tree, but it can only be harvested, or at least the majority of it is harvested from very, very young trees, younger than 3 years old. And therefore, it's one of the rare exceptions of a basic ag product that is actually not kosher because it's Orla. It's from a tree less than 3 years old. In Israel, the 4th year, that the fruit of that tree gets brought to Jerusalem. It's called Neta Ravai. Neta is a small tree. Ravai is the 4th year. The growth of the 4th year, so that fruit goes to Jerusalem. You can't eat it outside Jerusalem. So let's say you hire workers to go harvest the Neta Ravai. They're not allowed to eat from the tree. But let's say he didn't tell them that it was Neter Ravai. So Paidu Machilan. So like Meiser Sheni, that's in Jerusalem, Neter Ravai can be redeemed and brought to Jerusalem to eat. The monies are brought to Jerusalem, and with the money you buy food. Okay, if you say the obligation to feed the workers is a Isser obligation, it's an obligation from God, so then why do you need to do anything? The Torah only allows the workers to eat that which is permitted to eat. Meaning, Neter Ravai, which you're not allowed to eat, then if you're harvesting Neter Ravai, you don't get to eat it. God doesn't give you that to eat that which is prohibited to eat. Why do you need to redeem the Neter Ravai so that they are allowed to eat? The Torah doesn't allow you to eat that which is prohibited. So you never had a right to the stuff in the first place. So Gemara says, the reason is you're right. The truth of the matter is that they don't need you shouldn't really be obligated to pay toys is a sale that's made under false pretenses or a mistaken assumption. Right? So for example, I bought your car, or you bought my car, and you thought that my car actually drives. Turns out you were wrong. It doesn't drive. That would be an example of toys. Right? It's clearly the case is that a car that drives is probably worth many times a car that doesn't drive. So if you bought the car and you bought a price that you expect the car to drive and it doesn't drive, that's an example of the case. I'm thinking about the points. Now, this also, right? So you go to another firm Jew, you said, you want to work in my restaurant? He says, sure. So he thinks he's going to get lunch every day, right? Turns out your restaurant is actually non-kosher. It's a mega choice, and in that case, it could be the scenario that I just gave you. Also, you would be obligated to have you'd have lunch, and now it turns out you tricked him. And the same thing is here. You tricked him into harvesting a tree of netar. You have to give him food. So the Gemara says, "Ema Seifa." Let's look at the next half of the Mishnah. Okay, so over here he's dealing with. So one of the critical things we said about this idea of feeding your worker, it's in a very narrow subset. Technically speaking, there's no obligation to feed your restaurant worker. You're not obligated to feed him. You're obligated to feed mainly two types of workers, and we'll discuss this in more detail. You're obligated to feed a worker who's harvesting the fields, or he's working with the harvested material but hasn't yet been finished. How do we define finished? Depends each item according to how far it's usually taken. So, for example, if you're harvesting wheat, finishing means until it's turned into flour. Okay, now let's say you're harvesting figs. So some people, there was a major ordeal in the Talmudic times to make something called ktzitzes or igule dvelo. It's the same dish. I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of it or why it was so popular, but apparently you take all the figs, you'd smash them in a barrel, dry them out, and like the barrels, you get like a hat, like a Strymel hat, like this big thing full of figs. It was a yummy, delicious delicacy, and a lot of the figs went to create like these small fig cakes. These are fig cakes that are the size of the bottom of a barrel. Okay, so guys, so what happens? Nisparas agulov. So he started making these katsiyos. And what happened was pieces of the figs, dried figs, broke off, and they had to be smashed down again. Or nispatruch of Yosef, he had barrels full of wine, and they got opened. They have to be sealed. Now, what's the catch here? These are nigmaru melachton. You've already finished. These are finished products. Now, there's some minor defect that has to be sent for rework. So you're reworking it. You're fixing the barrels. You're not entitled to eat from this stuff because it's already finished. But if you didn't tell him, ma'aser machilon, you take off ma'aser because you're obligated at this point to take off ma'aser, and then you can give them to eat. Now, if you say that it's an isser obligation, meaning God tells you feed your workers, then why do you need to take off ma'aser and give them to eat from the barrels if you didn't tell them? Why don't you say that they're not permitted to eat it, so you're not obligated to feed it to them? So the Gemara says, and if you'll say maybe over here also is made under false pretenses. So let's examine this. In other words, the guy thought he was going to be able to eat on the job, and he wasn't. So it's a bishleim and isparas to agula of machzik toys. Okay, in other words, when a guy tells him he hires workers, he tells the guy, look, you're going to help me smash the figs to make the fig cakes. So the guy thinks, well, it's not finished yet. It's raw material now, and we're going to turn it into a fig cake. He didn't realize he was being hired for to rework something that broke, that wasn't up to standards. So that makes sense. It's possible that the guy was tricked. How exactly you tell a guy you hire a guy to fix your barrels that are filled with wine? Obviously, once they're pressed into wine, you're obligated to take off ma'aser. So how did you trick him? So basically, there was a hole, and it started flowing into the wine pit. And the guy got confused with the wine in the pit and the wine in the barrels. and he thought the wine was still in the pit, and therefore wouldn't be obligated in Meiser. The Gemara says, but that's not the case. V'tan yayin mishiyar lebar, that wine becomes obligated in Meiser from when it goes into the pit. Just very briefly here. So you dump the grapes on this platform where it's going to be pressed, either with people stepping on it or with a sort of stone or something. And then once it's pressed, it falls into a pit that's underneath the press. Once it goes into the pit, you're obligated to take off Meiser. So Gemara says, okay, well, we're going according to the other opinion. We're going to Rabbi Kiva's opinion. Mishiyikva basically means when the fermentation starts. Basically, they thought that it was pre-fermentation, so they'd be able to grab a cup of grape juice and drink it on the job. Turns out it was actually started to ferment already. In these barrels, the covers broke. It just needed to be fixed, but it had already started to ferment. Okay. 1 second. Okay. So why can't the owner tell the workers? He should have realized that it may have started to ferment. So Gemara says, that the guy who takes the guy who takes the wine from the pit into the barrels, he's the one that starts the fermentation. So they thought the wine was still in the barrel, was still in the pit, or at least some of the wine was in the pit. So they thought that the wine would not have started to ferment until it was going to the barrels. Now that Zvid said that yayin is obligated in Meiser once it goes into the pit and it starts fermenting. For Akiva Aimer Yishla b'chaviyos. Akiva says basically once it starts fermenting in the barrels. One second. Yeah. So Rakiva's opinion is not only does it have to start fermenting, but it has to finish the fermenting. See, and Rashi explains is the layer of foam that comes up on the top of the barrel after it ferments, and you have to sort of clean off that foam and clean off the floating skins and pits, and then cover the barrel. So the workers say, we didn't realize that you've already removed the foam. You've already cleaned up the barrel. You sort of like some sort of filtering process. Why can't the owner tell the workers? He should have realized that maybe I finished the fermentation and cleaned up the top of the barrel. Gemara says, "Ba'asra in a place that who desorek." 1 second. Who mashli? The guy who covers the barrels, he's the guy that ends the fermentation by cleaning away the foam and the particles, the floating skins. And they thought they heard the guy's covers needed help. They thought that it wasn't done, the job wasn't yet completed. Okay, back to the original question. Toshma, next proof. A person is allowed to forgive and charge extra and agree not to eat on the job. So he's hired to harvest grapes. He's kaitzitz. He's making an agreement. You pay me a little bit more, and I won't eat any grapes. Not only can he do this for himself, but he can also do this for his adult children, his adult slaves, by the Ishta and his wife. Why? Because they're intelligent and they can forgive their ability to eat on the job. His children, whether they're his children or whether they're his slaves' children, and not his animal. He cannot forgive that they can eat on the job. In other words, you must allow them to eat on the job, and you can't acquire that right. You can't write it off and ask for higher pay. We thought, we're talking about a scenario where you feed your work, where you're feeding everybody. So even the adult children are being fed by the father. If you say that if you say that the ability, the right, the obligation for an employer to feed his worker is an Isser obligation, it's an obligation to God. So then Mishum Hachi Ein Kaitzitz, that's why a child cannot forgive the obligation. But if you say that it's an obligation that could be transferred, why can't the father transfer the obligation away from the children to himself? Because he's feeding his kids. It's not like his kids are going hungry. They're being fed. And his kids have a right to be able to eat on the job when they're hired for the harvest. And he is selling that right and getting them a higher pay. And he's feeding them. So his kids are not going hungry. So why isn't that permitted? The Gemara says, what are we talking about? Actually, no, he's not feeding them. If he's not feeding them, then of course they have to eat on the job because that's how they're eating. So therefore, he has no right to take it away from them. So the Gemara says, adults as well. He has no right to forgive his adult children's ability to eat on the job. So the Gemara says, no, the adult children, if they agree to it, then they can forgive their ability to eat while on the job, even if they don't have another source, they don't have somebody who's feeding them. They'll have to work it out. They're adults. The Gemara says, we have a contradiction here from the statement of Rav Hashia. A person can agree to forgive himself, for his wife, but not for his animal. That's so far in line with what we previously saw. That also makes sense. Adult children, but not children. Here's the contradiction. You can agree to forgive the ability to eat from the tree for the slaves, whether they're adults or children. Even child slaves, the owner of the slave can make an agreement with the owner of the vineyard that his young slaves cannot eat, and he should get paid extra for it. Okay. Now that last line contradicts the Mishnah, which says in that scenario you can't eat. My love, it must be that idi ve'idi, both scenarios, all the scenarios in the Mishnah are talking about where he feeds his workers, or his sons, or his children, whether they're adults or children. And this is the debate here. Rav Hashia that says that you can effectively take away the ability to eat on the job from your child slaves. He is of the opinion that says the obligation to feed your worker is a financial obligation that could be transferred. Just like you're entitled to make your child slave work, you're also entitled to be able to sell his privilege of eating on the job for more money. You're giving him to eat anyway. That's fine. And the opinion that says you can't do that, he says it's an obligation to God, and therefore you cannot forgive a child. You cannot forgive a child's obligation. He's not old enough to forgive it himself, and even an owner of a slave can't forgive that obligation either. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. Everyone can agree that it's a financial obligation. The distinction between the two brises is, are you feeding them or are you not feeding them? If you're feeding your workers, you're feeding your slaves, then if you actually own the privilege of an employer eating on the job, an employee eating on the job, then the owner of the slave can sell that privilege because he's giving his slave what to eat. But if he's not giving his slave anything to eat, he can sell that privilege if the slave is a child. The Brisa of Rav Hoshe says you could sell a child slave's ability to eat on the job. That is talking about where you feed him. So Gemara says, "Ma'ikimta, what's the scenario? You're telling me that you're feeding the slaves. Why can't you sell the ability of your own children to eat on the job? Because you're feeding your children, just like you're feeding your slaves. You could sell your child slave's ability to eat on the job. Why can't you sell your child's ability to eat on the job? You're feeding your child, that's a monetary obligation. Why can't you sell it? The Gemara says, you don't have the ability to put your own children in pain. And therefore, you can't withhold them from eating on the job. They're not adults to forgive that. However, because the slave child, necessarily you can make him work, so there is the ability of the master to cause the child pain. So therefore, because it's a monetary obligation, he is allowed to sell the ability to eat on the job of the child slave. Okay, now we turn sideways a little bit. This was all based on an assumption that one is obligated to feed his slaves. Top of 93a, second line. There's a major debate in Talmud whether an owner is obligated to feed a slave. It could be he can tell him, every night to go to the local wedding hall and pick up the scraps at the end. I'm not feeding you. Go figure out how to make it yourself. According to the opinion that says you can't do that, you cannot do that, you must feed your slave. So then it stands to reason that if a child slave is not being fed, then you cannot take away his ability to eat on the job. However, if you are able to take away, you are able to take away the ability of this, you are able to not feed your slave, that would include a child slave, then regardless of whether you feed him or not, you should be able to take away his ability to eat on the job. You'll send him to the wedding hall that night or some other, the restaurant scraps in the back, to be able to eat there. So the Gemara says, okay, so the Gemara has to change it. Okay, so another way to understand the difference between the Brisa of Rav Hoshe and the Mishnah is this question itself. Are you able to tell your slave, I am not feeding you? Go figure it out on your own. According to the Brisa, it says you can sell the income you can sell the ability to eat on the job of your child slave. That opinion, that Brisa is of the opinion that you could tell your slave, go figure it out on your own. And the Mishnah that says you can't says you must feed your slaves. The Gemara says, okay, for Rabbi Yehudah, according to Rabbi Yehudah, that says that a master can tell his slave, work and I'm not giving you to eat, then it turns out he's actually going with the Brisa. But that doesn't make sense because Shavik Masisa Vavik Brisa, he's abandoning a Mishnah and preferring a Brisa. So Gemara says, you're right. According to Rabbi Yehudah, we go back to the original. 1 second. All right, hold on. El Kula Alma Mishal Shemayim U'Eichel. V'lei Motzi Kotzitz. U'may Kotzitz to Amr Oishia Mizonis to Kavasei. 1 second. So the Gemara says it could be that there's actually no contradiction in the Brises, according to Rabbi Yechanan. Both Brises say that you are allowed. 1 second. Hold on. Yeah, the both Brises are effectively agree that you are not allowed to sell your child slave's ability to eat on the job. However, eating on the job is an obligation to God. It's not an obligation to your friend. It's a non-transferable obligation, and therefore you have no right to sell a child's obligation because he's a child. He can't forgive it, and it's not a financial obligation that can be transferred. Now, why does Rav Hoshe say that you could sell it? It's because when Rav Hoshi says you give kaitzitz, it doesn't mean that you're selling his ability to eat on the job. What it means is you're making an agreement with the owner that you're going to give him like tons of steak before he starts, right? So if tons of steak, he'll be so full he won't be able to eat on the job. So it's a sort of strategy. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the Gemara says the Kavasei Gabi Behema Teven Nokatzlo. Well, 1 second. The mission says that the equivalent case of a child slave that you could sell, you're allowed to sell his ability to eat on the job, but an animal you can't. But if eating on the job here means actually stuffing yourself before the job, it's totally permissible to do that to an animal. There's nothing wrong with taking an animal who's about to plow a field and stuffing him so that he won't eat on the job. We saw previously, right? You can hang a bag of stuff from his yoke, and whenever the animal's hungry, he'll just eat from the bag. There's nothing wrong with that. So clearly, that if that's not permitted by an animal, what we're referring to is actually eating on the job, not eating before the job. So the Gemara says, okay, sure enough, you have to go back to the original position. According to Rabbi Yechanan's opinion, that an owner has the right to refuse food to his slave. The debate between the two brises about whether or not you're able to sell the right of your child slave to eat on the job is dependent on whether that's a financial obligation or whether it's a godly obligation. Okay. This mission we saw. A person can forgive the ability to eat on the job of himself, his children. Obviously, his children here are agreeing, his slaves, maidservants, either Ishta or his wife, because they have intelligence. This is the mission we just saw moments ago. But he can't forgive his children or his child slaves. There is no way he can forgive them from eating. He can forgive the owner of the field that he does not, that he would require them not to eat on the job. And nor with regard to his animal. You're not allowed to muzzle your animal on the job. Because they don't have the intelligence to forgive it. A guy hires workers to cut a field of net ravai. They cannot eat from the fruit. But if he didn't tell them the trees were net ravai, so then he has to redeem the net ravai and give them to eat from the trees. The fig cake came apart. The barrels that were filled with wine, they got open. They had to be sealed again. These items you should not. These items, if the workers were hired to fix these items, they cannot eat on the job because they're dealing with finished product. 1 second. If he didn't tell them, so ma'asa, you take off ma'aser, ma'achilan, and then they're allowed to eat. Shomrei Paris, people that watch the field, eichlan, they are allowed to eat on the job. Mehilchos Medina, because of the custom of the community, avaloy min Torah, but not biblically. And now the next Gemara deals with people that watch fields. Shomer Paris, those who watch the fields. Amarav loy shanol shomer ginos upardesin. These are only people that watch gardens or orchards. But if they're watching the wine presses or bundles of wheat, then they're allowed to eat. Katsavar, that's because Rav is of the opinion. Mishamer ka'isa ma'isa dami. A watchman is as if he's doing it's as if he's working. So let's explain. The guy is watching a garden or an orchard, so he's not harvesting. You're not harvesting, you don't have a right to take. You don't have a right to eat on the job. Except that the custom of the town was if you watched an orchard, you can grab an apple and eat it. So we have to allow that. But if you're watching things in the harvesting process, like bundles of wheat or a wine press, so then you're allowed to eat on the job. The security is a job. That's called doing in the property. So you're entitled to eat biblically. Shmuel disagrees. He says, those that watch presses and bundles of wheat, they're allowed to eat from the custom of the town. Those that watch gardens and orchards do not eat, period. They're not entitled to eat on the job. Because Shmuel's of the opinion, Mishamar lavka isamayis. A watchman is not considered to do anything. And therefore, the truth of the matter is, even watching wine presses and bundles, you also get nothing, even though it's in the middle of the harvest, because you're not doing anything. You don't have a real job. You're not a doer, and therefore you don't get to eat. Except the custom is that those who watch presses and bundles get to eat, so we have to let you eat. Okay, without getting into too much detail, but basically anyone involved in the preparation of the red heifer, the para aduma, becomes tamei. And who do you know becomes tamei? The watchman. So clearly the watchman's involved in the process. So clearly he's doing it. According to Shmuel, it says that a watchman is not considered to have been doing anything. So then why does he become tamei? Clearly he is involved. So actually, the reason why he becomes tamei is not because the watching makes him tamei, but because we presume there's gzeira shem yozes ba'aver. He may have pushed the animal. So therefore we make him tamei. And that sort of would be involvement in the parah, in the red heifer. Moser of Kahana, Mishamar Arbo v'chamish makshois. A guy is watching 4 or 5, I don't know what to call this, vegetable gardens, maybe. Maybe they have a better word in the article, I'm not sure. Hareza lo yamalei kreisem ye'echamen. So there are 5 different people. They have these vegetable patches, cucumber patches, as they translate it. Or like a gourd patch. Squash field. It's like 4 or 5 squash fields, and he's watching them together. So you shouldn't eat just from one guy's because they belong to 5 different people. Take a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, etc. If you tell me that a watchman is not doing anything, he's not harvesting here, he's just a watchman. He should get 0 according to Shmuel because he's not doing anything and the stuff isn't ready for harvest. So it's talking about where they're already uprooted from the ground. Well, that means if they're already uprooted from the ground, then you're obligated to take off meiser. And what do we know? A worker does not get to eat if the item is obligated to meiser. So the Gemara says the flour was still on. So the flour was still on. So it's in the middle of the harvesting process. And Shmuel says you can eat only because of the custom of the town. But the truth is, the fact that you're a watchman is not sufficient enough for you to biblically eat. Rashi says, and we'll end with this. We'll see. Kavasei the Shmuel Mustafra. The opinion of Shmuel makes sense. Now we have a brayse that says as follows. So listen closely here. Ve'elu oichlin min haTorah. The brayse begins with a massive caveat. These are the people that eat, but not just that they eat min haTorah. Biblically, you're obligated to feed them. And these are the 2 categories. Basically, a guy who's harvesting and a guy who's working with harvested materials before they were finished. The fact that Bryce introduces these people eat biblically, that means, well, there are those that eat, but not biblically. And that would be our Mishnah. Let's look at the end. The end of the Bryce says, there are those that don't eat. What does it mean they don't eat? It should say they don't eat biblically. What does don't eat mean? It means 0. Not biblically, not rabbinically. Nothing at all. The first part of the Bryce already told you who's biblical and who's rabbinical. It means it means these are the people that don't eat, period. And who's in that category? A guy who's working in the property prior to the harvest. And even if he's actually working, so he's weeding the property, he's trimming the trees, he's working in the property, he still doesn't get to eat, not even rabbinically. Certainly a watchman who's watching a field prior to its harvest, who's doing even less than the guy who's trimming and weeding, for sure he should not get to eat, not biblically nor rabbinically. Okay, next, let's start the first line of the first couple lines. The Mishnah, Arba Shomer Hein. This is already introduction for the next parak, and like we said, it's sort of a continuation from the interruption that we had in the beginning of this parak. There are 4 watchmen. We spoke about these in the past. Shomer Chinam, an unpaid watchman. Vashoyel, a borrower. Noisei Sachar, v'hasaycher, a paid watchman or a renter. These are the four categories. What's the rules? Shomer inam, an unpaid watchman, nishba al hakol. He makes an oath if anything happens, and he's exempt from paying. Hashayel, a borrower, mishalom asakol. He pays for everything. He doesn't make an oath. If there's any form of damage, he pays. The noises sachav asaycher, a paid watchman or a renter. Nishboim, they make an oath al hashvura if it breaks, al hashvuya if it was captured, al hamesa if it's died suddenly. All these are what we call oinus, beyond what's normal measures. However, they do pay if the item was lost or stolen because that involves some amount of negligence. Okay. Have a great day.